discussed in general about pollination in the last class, and I gave you fairly good idea about what pollination is and how many different types of pollination there are. Briefly, we did talk about the agencies of pollination and we talked about wind pollination. So, we will continue with the same thing in today's lecture. So, I will be talking to you about both abiotic as well as biotic types of pollination. Now, we started talking about wind pollination in the last class. So, I will take up wind pollination first of all. So, this concept of wind pollination, it arose mostly in areas of rainforest, because there the plants, they faced a very hostile environment because there was a lot of wind which was there, and this wind weakened the effectiveness of the smell, because smell is one of the attractants for insects to come to the plant for pollination. So, when there was lack of smell, so there had to be some other mechanism which had to be found out so that the plants could get pollinated. So, wind was one of them. Now, though wind is a very common method for pollination in plants, because wind pollinated species, there are many, there are 18% of angiosperm families and about 10% species which are pollinated by wind, but there is lack of precision, because pollination by wind is a 3-dimensional process. 3-dimensional, you would understand that there is a length, there is breadth and there is a height, or we can say that there is a volume. So, this is an inherently wasteful process. Mercurialis annua is one of the wind pollinated species which produces 1.25 billion pollen grains, because there is no direction to the movement of pollen grains, hence the plant has to produce huge quantities of pollen. Though the concentration of such pollen is low in air, but then they have the ability to travel long distances and they can travel up to 1200 kilometers. Now, the whole process of this wind pollination is driven by hit and miss processes, like there is no certainty of pollination being taking place. Pollen travel long distances, and only those pollen, they can travel long distances which are dry, they are non-sticky and they have a very smooth surface. Otherwise, if they are non-dry and they are sticky, they will keep adhering to whatever surface comes in their way. The other thing associated with anemophily or wind pollination is that the number of fertilizing pollen grains is low. The number of ovules in a single flower is also low. As a consequence, only a few seeds are produced in each fruit. This is seen in most grass species. So, here I would like to clarify, though the number of pollen grains produced is very, very large, huge quantities of pollen are produced, like I mentioned, it is a hit and miss or a 3-dimensional pollination, but the number of fertilizing pollen grains is low, because the certainty or the chance of the right type of pollen landing on the stigma, they are very low, and this is very commonly seen in most grass species. Now, because the wind is the carrier of pollen and there are no insects or other biotic agents involved, so the plant does not have to invest in any kind of a reward like a fragrance, petals, showy petals or nectar. So, the flowers are inconspicuous and they are devoid of any of these insect attractants. Flowering generally occurs before the leaves, the new leaves are produced, right, and the flowers are also produced, they are placed mostly towards the upper part of the plant, so that they are given an exposure to the wind. Whatever the flower part, its stamens or stigma or the entire flower or the inflorescence, they are able to move easily whenever there is a breeze or whenever the wind is blowing, so that the pollen are shaken out from the flowers. Anthers also sometimes they dehisce explosively, so that the pollen are dispersed or scattered to greater distances. Like I just mentioned, that pollen are non-sticky, they are very light, they are dry, and they are small, because the smaller the size, lesser is the weight, and it is easier for them to travel long distances. And these are some of the characteristics of pollen which aid them in quick dispersal to farther distances. Stigmas also have to be really efficient, so that they are able to catch all the pollen which are available. So, stigmas, they are generally feathery or lobed. Now, being feathery or lobed basically increases the overall surface area of the stigma, and they are able to catch more pollen grains. Wind pollinated species of one species, they often grow together in dense populations. This increases their chances of pollination. Now, the chance of self-pollination by wind is really minimized by the fact that most species which are pollinated by wind are dioecious. So, if the male and the female flowers are present on different, if the male or the female sex organs are present on different flowers, then chances of obviously self-pollination are minimal. Here you can see that these are spikes of Carex pendula. Carex is also wind pollinated species, and you see that there is minimal the perianth is minimal over here, and such flowers, the inflorescences, they are adapted for wind pollination. Most of the crop species which we know of, wheat, rice, corn, rye, barley, oats, these are pollinated by wind only. We know that pollen are produced in huge quantities, they are generally unornamented, they do not contain pollen kit, because you know pollen kit is sticky. So, it obliterates the possibility of clumping. Pollen, because they are non-sticky and they are not to attract any insect or any biotic pollinators, they are very low in nutritional content. The plant does not want to invest in creating nutrition, so there is no nectar, there is not much color, there is not large perianth which is produced. Another thing is that the number of ovules per ovary is very much reduced. Now, the thing is, the plant can strategize here. They can either produce large number of ovules and few flowers, or they can have more number of flowers with minimal number of ovules. So, all wind pollinated species, they have large number of flowers with very few ovules, because the chances of pollination are very bleak. The position of flowers is instrumental in capturing the airborne pollen, and inflorescences are not covered by foliage. Like I just told you that sometimes flowering occurs before the onset of appearance of leaves, so that the foliage does not become a hindrance for the movement of pollen and also for the stigma to capture the pollen grains. So, generally plants, they occur in a leafless canopy, as we have seen in mulberry. Now, in this particular picture, you can see there are three different pictures. The first one is a catkin-like inflorescence, which is seen in Salix tree. Second one is an exposed feathery stigma in grass, though we can also see versatile arrows marked by versatile anthers marked by arrows. And in the third one, there is this inflorescence of plantago. The thing which is common in all the three pictures is that they have exposed their anthers and stigmas in each one, and there is minimal perianth which you can see over here. Now, you have, each one of you has seen maize. We eat very commonly male bhutta or challi or sweet corn, whatever you call. Here, the male inflorescences are borne terminally on the plant, while the female inflorescences, which are also called as cobs, are present lower down, and they are also inclined laterally. In this particular plant, the pollen is very large, and whenever the wind blows, the tassels are shaken and the pollen are released, because eventually, because they are heavy in weight, so they will try to travel vertically downwards. So the stigmas which are present down below, they at this stage they catch the pollen. You would have seen in sweet corn also that the cob has those silk like threads coming from those leaf like structures, and these are the stigmas. So they project beyond the leafy envelopes, they are long receptive and they are ready to catch the pollen whenever the pollen they fall down. Now in this picture on the left hand side, you see that there is a plantation of maize plants. On the right hand side, there is male inflorescence, and also you can see the female cob, and also you can see those hair like or silk like stigmas which are receptive whenever the male pollen transits below and they catch the pollen grains, hence accomplishing pollination. Now, if I have to give you a recap of the reproductive traits and ecological conditions which are associated with wind pollination, so what would we be talking about? We know that the stigma is feathery and the pollen ovule ratio is high, and then the plant does not invest in any of fragrance or nectar or perianth. Size of the pollen grains is less than 50 microns, they are non-sticky, they are dry. And if we talk about the ecological conditions, wherever wind pollination takes place, the wind speed is low to moderate, humidity is low, precipitation is minimal or we can say infrequent, and the other thing which is important over here is that plants they grow in dense populations. Another type of pollination which is abiotic in nature is hydrophily, which is also called as the pollination by water. Now, pollination by water does not mean that whichever plants which are growing in aquatic habitats, they are pollinated by water. Aquatic habitat itself is not an indication of plant being pollinated by water. Out of 380 aquatic angiosperms, 119 are exclusively wind pollinated. Only 3% of all angiosperm families are pollinated by water or are hydrophilous. Here also, like we talked about wind pollination, the floral envelopes, they are highly reduced or absent, and there is a high pollen ovule ratio which is present. All the species, they have a very reduced pollen exine. The specific gravity of pollen is almost the same as that of water. Now, the enlarged receptive surface of stigma or style is there so that the probability of catching the pollen grains is increased. Like wind pollination or like anemophily, even hydrophily is an inherently wasteful process because of non-directionality of pollen, which leads to huge losses of pollen. If the water is shallow, then probably the efficiency of pollination is more because there is more pollen load concentrated in shallow waters. Hydrophily is of two types, that is ephydrophily, which takes place on the surface of water, and hiphydrophily, which takes place underwater, right. So, when we talk about types of hydrophily, it is ephydrophily and hiphydrophily, but I would like to mention here that there is another form of pollination called as ambrophily, which is pollination by rainwater. Now, pollination by rainwater is when water is the agent for carrying the pollen grain, but this primarily happens in terrestrial plants. Now, when it is autogamy, that is pollen float in water within a flower to reach the stigmas of the same flower, then it is autogamous ombrophily. And when the pollen reach the stigmas of other flowers by splashing of water, whenever there is rain and there is splashing of water, then it is allogamous ombrophily which takes place. Now this picture shows ep hydrophily in Vallisneria. Ep, I said, is above. So this is above the surface of water. Note the male flowers which are floating on the surface of water, and female flowers are also present on the surface of water. Basically, with the elongation of the pedicel of the female flower reaches the surface of the water, and so is present the male flower. This is a type of hydrophily which occurs on the surface of water. Female flower, like you have seen here, it has a very long pedicel, and you can also see that sometimes it becomes a little bit coiled, you know. Female flower has a long pedicel which assists it to reach the surface of water. Male flowers, after breakage from the stalk, they come to float on the surface of water, and while they are floating on the surface of water, pollen are released which are carried by the water currents to the stigma. So eventually they reach the female flower stigma and they effect pollination. This is hip hydrophily in Ceratophyllum. Ceratophyllum is again an aquatic plant which is present submerged in water bodies. It is free floating in the water body. So you can see that on the left hand side there is a red structure which is a female flower, and there is an enlarged ovary and a very small stigma which is present. Okay. On the right hand side you can see that there are bunch of sessile stamens which comprise the male flower. So what happens in Ceratophyllum is that the anthers, they dehisce and they come to lie on the surface of water, and they germinate in situ, that is, while they are present in the stamens, they germinate, they are present on the surface of water, and with the weight of the pollen tubes, these stamens, they become heavy and they start moving downwards, or they start descending in the water, and while descending, when the receptive stigmas come in their way, they pollinate the female flowers. Hip hydrophily is of common occurrence in all the sea grasses, like we have Zostera, Halophila, Thalacia and Naias. Zostera is very characteristic in nature because the pollen here are exceptionally long, which are needle like, sometimes also called noodle like, because they look more like pollen tubes and they have the same specific gravity as sea water. That is why they are able to float in the water. They float freely and they coil around the stigma whenever they come across one. In Halophila and Thalacia, the pollen are spherical and they are wettable. And another important feature is that they are shed as a coherent mass along with the thecal slime. So this serves to adhere pollen to the stigmatic papillae. Naias has a type of pollination which is very similar to that what I told you about Ceratophyllum. Male flowers are positioned above the carpellate ones. Pollen being heavier than water, they sink in the water body, pollinating the stigmas on root. I was just talking to you about Thalacia. So here you can see that in picture A, it is the dehisced anther which you can see, there are longitudinal slits, and in B portion of the picture, pollen grains can be seen engulfed in a mucilage. Then there is biotic pollination. Biotic pollination is by means of an agent. It can be an insect or a bird or an animal. So different names are given to different types of pollinations depending on the animal or insect or bird, whichever is the agent. When we talk about entomophily, it is pollination by insects. Now, further in entomophily, there are many types because there are many types of insects which are involved in pollination. The most common being the bees, then there are wasps and butterflies, moths, etc. Ornithophily is pollination by birds. Chiropterophily is pollination by bats. Now this is a very rare picture where you can see a Florida carpenter ant which is collecting nectar from a black mangrove flower. This is a collection of some of the pictures where there are different types of biotic agents which are involved in pollination. You can see moths, butterflies, bees, beetles, etc. When the pollination is carried out by the bees and wasps, we call it as melitophily. Fly pollination is myophily, ant pollination is myrmecophily, butterfly pollination is psychophily, moth pollination is sphingophily, and beetle pollination is cantharophily. Pollination by bees and wasps is called as melitophily. Now, there can be bees, flies, butterflies and beetles which pollinate during the day and they are diurnal in nature, whereas wasps, moths, they pollinate at night and hence they are nocturnal. 80% of the pollinations in crop species, they are handled by the bees, and such species, such plants, they are characterized by presence of showy brightly colored flowers, usually blue, purple or yellow, because bees are color blind to red. Okay. And this is in general about biotic pollination. We will continue this in the next class. Thank you.